I come across the latest from Noam Chomsky, who always scares the hell out of me. I don't care what Chomsky's writing about. It could be the Middle East. It could be nuclear weapons. It could be the political situation in this country or any of dozens of countries. But Chomsky, being who he is, every time he writes something that I come across, it's scary, very scary. So he did a quick piece, or was interviewed by George Eaton from the New Statesman, and this is available only today. And Professor Chomsky is warning that the climate crisis, the threat of nuclear war, that one slipped our minds, hasn't it? And rising authoritarianism or fascism, all of this taken together mean the risk to human extinction has never been greater. I had to think whether or not I wanted to start the week with this, gentle listener, because I know that, like me, you're probably right on the edge of the limit of your tolerance of just about everything at this point, huh? Are you at that point yet? Anyway, Chomsky has warned that the world is at the most dangerous moment in human history because of those three conditions I just mentioned: the climate crisis, nuclear war, and authoritarianism. He gave an exclusive interview to the New Statesman. Chomsky's now 91. Holy Jesus. Anyway, in this interview, Chomsky says that the current horrors that we're facing exceed those of the 1930s. Now, remember the 30s, the rise of Nazism, world economic destruction, poverty, starvation. But Chomsky said this. Some of this will be direct quotes from him, and I will indicate if they are. Quote, "There's been nothing like it in human history. I'm old enough to remember very vividly the threat that Nazism could take over much of Eurasia. That was not an idle concern. U.S. military planners did anticipate that the war would end with the U.S.-dominated region and a German-dominated region. But even that, horrible enough, was not like the end of organized human life on Earth, which is what we are now facing." End quote. Brrr. Now, Chomsky, this interview was conducted in advance of the first summit of the Progressive International. That was this weekend. Just passed. Did you hear about it? It's a new organization founded by Bernie Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. That's an interesting couple, isn't it? And it was put together to counter right-wing authoritarianism. In an echo, it says here, of the movement's slogan, which said the slogan is this: internationalism or extinction, which I completely agree with, completely. Anyway, Chomsky warned this, quote, "We're at an astonishing confluence of very severe crises. The extent of them was illustrated by the last setting of the famous doomsday clock. It's been set every year since the atom bombing. The minute hand has moved forward and back, but last January, they abandoned minutes and moved to seconds to midnight. Midnight means termination. And that was before the scale of this pandemic. End quote. See what I mean? Every time I pick up Chomsky, I know I'm going to get some hard truths. As Brother Dave Gardner used to call them, hard truths. Here's one. It isn't the pendulum swinging to and fro, but the essence that drives it that makes us go. That's a hard saying, hard truth, same thing. Here's another one. There are those of us who are bound in the round, who have a tendency to put down those who are bound in the square. But it is neither the round nor the square that leads to the top of the heap. It is the spiral. Okay. Brother Dave is not Noam Chomsky and vice versa. However, just trying to make a point. Anyway, this shift, Chomsky said, in the danger that the human species now finds ourselves in, Chomsky said it reflected, quote, the growing threat of nuclear war, which is probably more severe now than it was during the Cold War, the growing threat of environmental catastrophe, and the third thing that they've been picking up for the last few years is the sharp deterioration of democracy, which sounds at first as if it doesn't belong with the other two, but it actually does, because the only hope for dealing with the two existential crises, which do threaten extinction, is to deal with them through a vibrant democracy with engaged, informed citizens who are participating in developing programs to deal with these crises, end quote. Well, that's certainly not us, is it, truth seekers? Huh? Not with the leadership we have, and not with the ennui and the angst and the seeming inability of us, you and me, to move, to do something beyond. I'm not talking about the demonstrations for civil rights, human rights that we've witnessed over the past 6 months. No. I'm not talking about the demonstrations against the slaughter of people of color. Those are powerful and they're important, and I hope to God they're ongoing. But what I'm talking about here, I should say what Chomsky's talking about, are existential threats that if we do not address are going to devour us. There's no other way to look at this. Chomsky added this. He said that, quote, Donald Trump has accomplished something quite impressive. He's succeeded in increasing the threat of each of these dangers. On nuclear weapons, he's moved to continue and essentially bring to an end the dismantling of the arms control regime, which has offered some protection against terminal disaster. Trump has greatly increased the development of new, dangerous, more threatening weapons, which means others do so too, which is increasing the threat to all of us. Chomsky goes on, quote, on environmental catastrophe, Trump has escalated his efforts to maximize the use of fossil fuels and to terminate the regulations that somewhat mitigate the effect of the coming disaster if we proceed on our present course. On the deterioration of democracy, Chomsky goes on, it's become a joke. The executive branch of the U.S. government has been completely purged of any dissident voice. Now it's left with a group of sycophants. End quote. Chomsky in this piece is urging leftists in this country to vote for Biden in the upcoming election. Vote for Biden and then try to push him towards a more progressive agenda than what Biden would be comfortable with. This is what Chomsky said, quote, what the left should do is what it always should do. It should recognize that real politics is constant activism in one form or another. Every couple of years, something comes along called an election. You should take off a few minutes to decide if it's worth voting against somebody, rarely for somebody. In the course of, say, Corbyn in England, I would have voted for him, but most of the time the question is, who do you vote against? He goes on, this time the answer to that question is just overwhelmingly obvious. The Trump Republicans are so utterly outrageous, way off the spectrum, that there's simply no question about voting against them. So you take off a few minutes, go to the voting booth, push a lever, vote against Trump, which in a two-party system means you have to push the vote for the other candidate. But then the next thing you do is to challenge them, keep the pressure on to move them towards progressive programs. End quote. How do you and I can't. It is utterly, absolutely, totally impossible for me or you to press a President Biden to do anything. It's just impossible. By the nature of the system under which we all live, and by the nature of the massive population that is this country. What are you going to do? You're going to write a letter, email, telephone call, BFD, right? The only option we have is here on the local level, whether you're a member of Congress, you're the House member of Congress. And if you are lucky to have a senator who is responsive, then the Senate also. But how do you, in the age of gerrymandering and the age of the gutting of the Civil Rights, the Voting Act, the Civil Rights legislation, how do you pressure your representative to do the right thing? I don't know. There must be a way, because it's impossible to pressure the president. You know who pressures a president? The people who have his ear. Who has his ear? You don't. I don't. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast, or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.